Good afternoon. My name is Helen Baxendale. I am the Chief of Staff and Vice President of Strategy at Great Hearts Academies, and I have the distinct pleasure this afternoon of introducing the Cicero Chamber Singers. These are comprised of sophomores, juniors, and seniors from Cicero Prep Academy, and this group recently earned the distinction of Superior at the annual Arizona Jazz Madrigal Festival, and is looking forward to an even bigger and better singing season next school year. They are here to perform a brief musical interlude for us before our next keynote. So please welcome and thank the singers of Cicero Prep.
Viva, viva, viva la musica, viva la musica, viva, viva, viva la musica, 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 viva la musica. Viva la musica, 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 long live music, long live music, long live music. Long live music. Viva la musica, viva la musica, viva la musica, viva la musica. Viva la musica, viva la musica, viva la musica, viva la musica. Viva la musica, viva la musica, viva la musica, viva la musica. Viva la musica, 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 viva la viva la musica.
Aunua gaudia Jacobe debita sunti vidanda.
Aunua gaudia Jacobe debita sunti vidanda.
Organado cia convenientia sunt resonanda.
Organado cia convenientia sunt resonanda.
Et tua celica facta perhenia sunt reseranda.
Et tua celica facta perhenia sunt reseranda.
Organado cia convenientia sunt resonanda.
Organado cia convenientia sunt resonanda.
Et omne splendida secla per omnia sunt memoranda.
Et omne splendida secla per omnia sunt memoranda.
Organado cia convenientia sunt resonanda.
Organado cia convenientia sunt resonanda.
Tam piatam bonatam ratatam suditanda.
Tabiatam bonatam ratatam suditanda.
Organaducia convenientia sub resonanda.
Organaducia convenientia sub resonanda.
Ex sacra commoda florida fugida sudada manda. Ex sacra commoda florida fugida sudada manda. Organaducia convenientia sub resonanda. Organaducia convenientia sub resonanda.
Thank you again to the Cicero Chamber Singers for that marvellous showcase of the musical programming that happens at many of our Great Hearts Academies. Before I introduce our next speaker, I'd like to say a quick word about the sponsor of Mr. Abbott's address, the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Since its founding in 2017, the SCETL, as it's more economically known, has been a wonderful partner to Great Hearts, providing fantastic professional development to many of our teachers, several of whom have gone on to complete masters in classical liberal education and leadership. And the SCETL has also provided an undergraduate home to many Great Hearts students who have relished the opportunity to continue their study of great books in small Socratic seminars, all the while attending a large public research institution. So thank you to the SCETL for being such a great partner in our shared endeavours. Our next speaker has travelled a very long way to be with us today, but as a classically educated man of letters, I'd like to think this event is something of an intellectual homecoming for him. Many of you likely know of Mr. Abbott as the 28th Prime Minister of Australia, an office he held between 2013 and 2015. What is perhaps less well known is the important work that Tony Abbott has done since leaving high office to advance the cause of classical liberal arts education and the study of the Western canon in his native Australia and abroad. Mr. Abbott has been a pivotal figure in the founding and flourishing of the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilisation, in some regards an analogue to the Great Hearts Institute, which promotes the study of Western civilization through scholarships, educational partnerships, and public events. In addition, he is the chairman of Australia's foremost literary and cultural journal, Quadrant, and serves on the Council for the Australian War Memorial and the advisory board of the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, an international community of scholars, artists, and political and cultural leaders with a vision for a better world where every citizen can prosper, contribute, and flourish. I first met Mr. Abbott 17 years ago when I began working in his parliamentary office part-time alongside my undergraduate studies. As you might imagine, this was a fascinating introduction to the cut and thrust of Australian politics, but it was also an unexpectedly formative intellectual experience. It was in Mr. Abbott's employ, rather than through my political science and history degree, that I first encountered the philosophy of Michael Oakeshott and Roger Scruton, the comic novels of Evelyn Waugh. One of my favourite assignments was pulling together notes for his speeches. He always did the actual writing himself. because it so often involved checking quotes from the likes of Samuel Johnston, Tolstoy, Churchill, and Chesterton, and in the process frequently launched me on edifying diversions from my formal studies. So Tony, it is an honour for me to be able to introduce you to this audience today, and also to thank you publicly for the great influence you had on my early intellectual development and for the educational leadership you have offered both in high office and since in our native Australia and abroad. Ladies and gentlemen, Tony Abbott.
Thanks, Helen. Well, thank you, Helen. It's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to see one of my former staff members doing such wonderful things and exercising such wonderful academic and cultural leadership here in the United States. I should begin by just accepting that there are different perspectives on different sides of the Pacific. I apologise to anyone who I've said this to before, but my first official visit to the United States was back in 1995. At the time, there was a big debate going on in Australia about whether we should sunder our ties with the monarchy and become a republic, and I was very much in favour of sticking with the Crown. And I was a very hardline member of our centre-right party, which rejoices in the name of the Liberal Party. And so the message came back from Canberra to my hosts in Washington that the visitor was very anti-Republican and very strongly liberal. And so I spent most of my fortnight in the United States fraternising with virtual communists. But I'm assured that's not the case today. Years ago, I was still playing rugby football in Oxford, England, and there were these line-out calls requiring the recognition of particular letters. If the captain called a word starting with the letter T, the ball went to the front of the line-out. But if he called a word starting with the letter S, it went to the back of the line-out. But on this occasion, the captain called Tchaikovsky. The resulting chaos among the students of a great university highlighted the need for a well-rounded classical education, even for those who took their sport as seriously as their studies. Now, with 40 schools already in several US states, some 30,000 students, and aiming to spread much more widely, I'm here to congratulate the Great Hearts Academies on your success in promoting an education based on the Western canon and the importance of inculcating in all young people the true, the beautiful, and the good. You're absolutely not repeating the failings of most modern education, the near disappearance of grounding in the New Testament, even though it's at the heart of our culture, the absence of narrative history, our story from Abraham, Jacob and Moses, our fathers in faith, through the ancient Greeks and Romans to Alfred the Great, Magna Carta, the provisions of Oxford, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the Glorious Revolution, an American revolution for the rights of Englishmen in the New World, and a French one based on worthy abstractions that ultimately descended into tyranny, and on to our own times with the illusory ascendancy of market liberalism, because man does not live by bread alone, and the eruption of critical theory that's turned great literature and the triumphs of the human spirit into a fantasy of oppressors and oppressed. No, the Great Hearts schools have resolved to teach by example rather than admonition, to be optimists, not pessimists, and that's just as well, for there's still much to be grateful for. In 1990, for instance, more than 30% of the world's population lacked access to safe drinking water. By 2020, that figure was under 10%. Likewise, in 1990, more than 30% of the world's population lived in absolute poverty. That too had declined to under 10% by 2020. And in 2020, more wealth had been created, at least in dollar terms, over the previous 25 years than in the prior 2,500. Prior to the pandemic, the world at large was more free, more fair, more safe, and more rich for more people than at any previous time in human history, largely thanks to the long Pax Americana, based on a preference for whatever makes societies freer, fairer, and more prosperous under a rules-based global order. But while the Western world has never been more materially rich, it's rarely been more spiritually bereft. Relieved of the need to build its strength and assert its values against the old Soviet Union, like a retired sportsman, it's become economically, militarily, and culturally flabby. The pandemic was a largely self-inflicted wound. The policies to deal with it were more destructive than the disease itself. And for years we'll face the corrosive legacy of mental illness, other diseases that were comparatively neglected, economic dislocation, the surrender to authoritarian experts, and worst of all, 2 years of stopping living from fear of dying. And now there's the ferocious assault on Ukraine, the renewed challenge of apocalyptic Islamism, especially against Israel, and Beijing's push to be the world's dominant power by mid-century, with all that means for free and democratic Taiwan, for the rest of East Asia, and for the continued flourishing of the liberal order that's produced the best times in history so far. In the face of an intensifying military challenge from dictatorships on the march, militarist, Islamist, communist, it might seem trivial, almost escapist, to stress the life of the mind. But in the end, this is a battle of ideas, the power of the liberal humanist dream of men and women created with inherently equal rights and responsibilities, free to make the most of themselves individually and in community, versus various forms of might is right based on national glory, death to the infidel, or the dictatorship of the proletariat. In most Western countries, people's faith in democracy is shrinking. Mental illness, especially amongst the young, is a new epidemic. And while this may or may not be related to the waning of the Christian belief in the God-given dignity and worth of each person that incubated liberal democracy and that armoured its adherents against pride and despair, it's noteworthy that the Christianity that was professed by some 90% of Australians when I was young is now acknowledged to the census by well under half the population. Politics, it's often said, is downstream of culture, and culture is downstream of religion. It's the coarsening of our culture, exacerbated by the long march through the institutions, that's at least partly to blame for the feeble or embarrassing leadership from which we now suffer, and for the triumph of prudence over courage and weakness over judgment, which has produced virtue signalling businesses, propaganda pretending to be learning, the elevation of every kind of diversity except intellectual diversity, the muddling of badging what's mostly climate change policy as an Inflation Reduction Act, eruptions of anti-Semitism, out-of-control social spending, and a drug culture in parts of Western cities which can only be the product of moral anarchy. In the long run, the antidote to this is to rediscover all that's given meaning to most people in every previous generation, a knowledge of our history, an appreciation of our literature, and an acquaintance with the faith stories that might not inspire every individual, but which have collectively moved mountains over millennia. I was lucky enough to be schooled under Brigittine nuns and then under Jesuit priests and the lay teachers who took inspiration from them. Fine, selfless people who saw teaching as a calling more than a career, encouraging their charges at every turn to be their best selves. Their lives were about our fulfilment, not theirs, as reflected in the Jesuit injunction of those days to be a man for others, because it's only in giving that we truly receive. Later, at Sydney University and especially at Oxford, I had teachers who valued their students' ability to assimilate the authorities and to create strong arguments for a distinctive position rather than regurgitate lecture notes and conform to some expert. Indeed, this is the genius of Western civilisation, a respect for the best of what is, combined with a restless curiosity for more, a constant willingness to learn, because no one has the last word in wisdom and knowledge. The whole point of a good education is not to unlearn, as Sydney University has recently put it, but to assimilate all the disciplines, intellectual and personal, that make us truly free to have life and to have it unto the full. The Oxford tutorial system, where twice a week you had to front up to someone who was a genuine expert in his field with an essay demonstrating familiarity with the main texts and the main arguments on a particular topic, plus a considered position of your own, was the perfect preparation for any form of advocacy, particularly politics, where you always have to be ready to apply good values to hard facts. And these days, as a board member of the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilisation in Australia, I'm conscious of the many elements of the Western canon that I have personally largely missed in over-focusing on politics with only a smattering of philosophy and theology from a brief pursuit of the priesthood, but am still immensely grateful for an intellectual and cultural and spiritual inheritance that I've now been drawing down over 40 years of advocacy, journalism and public life. I have few claims to particular expertise, save perhaps in political decision-making, and certainly no claims to personal virtue, because an inevitably imperfectly and incompletely practiced Christianity doesn't guarantee goodness, but it does make us better than we otherwise would be. This constant spur to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. Example and experience are often the best teachers of all. For me, a mother who welcomed everyone into our family home, a late father who urged me to look for the good that's present in almost everyone, an inspirational teacher, the late Father Emmett Costello, who encouraged me to set no limits on what could be achieved, a boon friend, the late Father Paul Mankowski, my Oxford sparring partner, a kind of internal exile inside the Jesuit order, who showed that a celibate priest could also be a real man, and the luminous Cardinal George Pell of blessed memory, who endured a modern martyrdom, a form of living crucifixion, and whose prison diaries deserve to become modern classics. One day, I hope, again to enjoy the communion of these saints. I was lucky indeed to have a reasonably broad experience beyond the classroom and beyond the confines of public life. Coaching football teams was an early introduction into managing egos. Running a concrete batching plant, a great antidote to pure economic theory and to corporate flim-flam, and a goad to unconventional problem solving. Plus, serving in a local volunteer fire brigade for over 2 decades has been a wonderful lesson in grassroots community service. My Jesuit mentor, Father Costello, had a favourite phrase, genus humanum vivat paucis, which he translated, the human race lives by a few. Of course, there's no discredit to being among the many who largely follow, because no one can lead unless others fall in behind. And whatever our individual role, large or small, public or private, sung or unsung, our calling is to be as good as we can be, because even small things, done well or badly, make a difference for better or for worse. Everyone's duty, indeed, is to strive to leave the world that much better for our time here. Our families, our neighbourhoods, our workplaces, our classrooms, our churches, everything we do should be for the better as best we can make it. Still, some are called to more than worthily performing all the things that are expected of us. Leaders are those who go beyond what might be expected, who don't just fill the job but expand it, even transcend it, who aren't just competent but brilliant. To paraphrase the younger Kennedy, they don't look at what is and ask why, but ponder what should be and try to make that happen. In my time as Prime Minister, there were decisions to be made every day, expected and unexpected. Ultimately, the job of a national leader is to try to make sense of all the most difficult issues and to offer people a better way forward. Inevitably, there's much that has to be managed as much as determined, because much is more or less intractable, at least in the short term. The challenge is to keep pushing in the right direction so that things are better, even though they may never be perfect or even especially satisfactory. No matter how many changes you make and how much leadership you try to provide, economic reform, for instance, or Indigenous well-being, for instance, is always going to be a work in progress. There's no doubt that leadership can be more or less effective depending on the character, conviction and courage of the relevant leader. This is the human factor in history that's so often decisive, such as when the British Conservative Party in 1940 chose Churchill rather than Halifax to invigorate the war effort against Nazism. In the end, leadership is not about being right or wrong so much as being able to make decisions and to get things done. In providing leadership, what matters is the judgment and the set of values brought to decision making, at least as much as technical knowledge. The same set of facts, for instance, namely the surrender of France and the evacuation from Dunkirk, would have produced different leadership from Halifax than from Churchill. But it would hardly be fair to claim that Churchill's education at Sandhurst was better than Halifax's at Oxford. It was their character, disposition and judgment that differed. Just as the respective characters' judgment of Presidents Biden and Zelensky so sharply differed when one offered an expedient escape from Kyiv and the other contemptuously refused it. Still, there's no doubt that education can help to shape character and that judgment can be enhanced by the knowledge of history and the appreciation of the human condition that a good education should provide. I'm sometimes asked by young people with an interest in politics what they should do to be more effective. And my answer is never to join a faction, to consult polling, or to seek any particular office. It's to immerse yourself in the best that's been thought and said, so that whatever you do will be better for familiarity with the wisdom of the ages. In particular, it's to read and to reread the New Testament, the foundation document of our culture that shaped our moral and mental universe in ways we can hardly begin to grasp, and which speaks to the best instincts of human nature. And to bury yourself in history, especially a history that's alive to the difference individuals make and to the importance of ideas, of which a riveting example is Churchill's magnificent 4-volume history of the English-speaking peoples. That's also pretty much a global history, given that so much of the modern world has been made in English, and which Andrew Roberts has subsequently brought more or less up to date with his own history of the English-speaking peoples in the 20th century. Then there's the book. I don't claim it's the finest ever written, just the one that's most colonised my own imaginings, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, an epic adventure in duty and service, with obvious Christological echoes in which the dividing line between good and evil, wisdom and folly, honour and indulgence runs through nearly every heart, which I must have read at least a half a dozen times, most recently to my adolescent children, who naturally enough preferred the movie to my storytelling. There's a scene in the 1970 Western, Chisholm, when John Wayne's character is trying to dissuade Billy the Kid from wanton murder. "But that's all just words," says the hot-headed youngster. "Yes," replies John Wayne, "but words are what men live by, words that they say and mean." Those were the days when Hollywood was indeed a moral teacher. And as for movies, my favourites have been Saving Private Ryan and the Australian classic Gallipoli, whose protagonists were pitched into vast conflicts way beyond their control, while retaining the agency to make a difference, especially by not living in fear of dying, and by remembering that to whom much is given, much is expected. Plus the wonderful Life of Brian that so satirises today's decolonising and gender follies that it could hardly be made, yet still manages to respect the greatest story ever told. So imagine for a moment having to tackle every aspect of life with only your own physical and mental resources, or with only the learning and the capability of those with whom you were in close contact. Even with abundant goodwill, life would be a Hobbesian ordeal, poor, nasty, brutish and short. But with education, there's access to the accumulated wisdom of mankind. Our task is to have the wit and the decency to make the most of it. At its best, education gives us access, not just to this generation's wisdom and knowledge, but to all the wisdom and knowledge that's ever been. It adds to our own experience and judgment, the experience and judgment of the greatest figures and the best thinkers that have ever lived. It makes their world ours too. It's education that opens up to each of us the wisdom of Plato, Aristotle and Aquinas, the insights into human behaviour of Shakespeare and Dickens, the creative imagination of Da Vinci and Michelangelo, the soulfulness of Handel and Bach, the scientific genius of Newton and Einstein, the daring and curiosity of James Cook and Marco Polo, and the courage and ambition of Julius Caesar and Napoleon. It gives us the world's example to reflect upon. It enables us to be so much better than would otherwise be the case in the ceaseless endeavour that should be the object of every life, to become our very best selves. there's hardly a heavier responsibility than the right nurturing of young people through a judicious combination of the good teaching, the good example and the good practice to which the Great Hearts Academies aspire. Every teacher should reflect on the gospel warning against anything that might lead young people astray. Better for him that a millstone were hanged around his neck and that he were drowned in the depths of the sea. That's a judgment that the Great Hearts Academies at least should magnificently avoid. When screens are demanding every minute of young people's attention, you have the responsibility to refocus their gaze. When the saturation of social media preys on young people's insecurities, it's up to you to ground them back in reality. When your students are tempted to see themselves as victims, your job is to encourage them to count what blessings they have and still make the best choices they can. When today's storytellers are saying our history is more marred by villains than illuminated by heroes, it's up to you to pass on the torch of culture, for without a vision, the people perish. Your work is more important than ever because each of us is shaped by all our lessons learned. Churchill's teachers changed the world in ways they could hardly have guessed at the time, and likewise the teachers of today can tilt the world of tomorrow towards good. Let me close with the immortal words of the late Queen Elizabeth on her 21st birthday, that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong. No one should be in ignorance of such a life, such an exemplar of the duty and service, the honour and the fealty by which all should live. Yet but for the study of history, what will future generations know of our mighty forebears and how they lived and how they died for family, for country and for God? Thank you. I cut out your things. But I'd get in a dig about the Inflation Reduction Act being a green boondoggle.
We're now going to invite questions from the audience, Tony, but while people scramble, as I'm sure they will, to the microphone here at the front of the room to ask you questions, I thought I would exercise the prerogative of the moderator and ask you to expand a little bit on your most influential teachers. You mentioned Father Emmett Costello. As we are among a room of predominantly teachers, it'd be interesting to hear a little more on what made him such a distinctive and formative teacher in your life, and if there are others that really had an influence.
Well, the first teacher your best teachers are your parents, obviously. They're your first teachers. And so, my mum and dad were great influences for good. But in terms of professional teachers, as it were, the first teacher I can really remember very well was Mother Ignatius back in Year 2. And Mother Ignatius was quite elderly. She was about 75 years old and she had a class of more than 70 kids to look after. But through sheer force of personality and I guess the judicious distribution of lollies at the right time to the right people.
That's candy for our American audience. Yeah.
She kept us all under control, and I can still remember some of the stories that she told 60 odd years after the event. So look, I was incredibly blessed, but I suppose the key thing to all of the really good teachers that I remember from my school days is that they had a very, very strong vocation, whether they had a religious vocation or whether they had a vocation to teaching, it wasn't just a job. It wasn't just a career. It was a life, and they really threw themselves into it, and I'm sure they lived and breathed it every waking moment, not just between 9 and 3 when they're actually in the classroom.
That's a great answer, thank you. Questions from the floor?
In an environment in the United States where secularism seems to push religious reference out of almost every classroom, including almost every public school, perhaps every public school, and to hear you quote the New Testament several times in a refreshing way, what advice do you have for classical teachers with that most central Western text, the New Testament? How can they have the courage to do that in today's environment of secularism?
Well, I'm not very familiar with the rules that American teachers and schools have to labour under, but I do understand that the separation of church and state is taken a little to extremes sometimes here in this country. I guess any decent school, regardless of its religiosity or lack thereof, that wants to give its youngsters a good grounding in how people think and in what has made our society what it is, should be studying the Bible generally, but the New Testament in particular, the Gospels in particular, because they are foundational cultural artefacts. And, you know, don't think that America's the only place that's down on religion, particularly Christian religion. In Australia, I regret to say that to the extent that we have any religion these days, it's Indigenous ancestor worship, because we can't begin any civic event these days without an acknowledgement of the Indigenous traditional owners and pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So this is a general problem, and I'm all in favour of doing what we can to study, appreciate and understand the Indigenous cultures of Australia's First Peoples. I'm all in favour of that. I just wish we would pay equal respect to the foundational culture of our society and our civilisation.
Sir, I thank you for your talk, especially for your invocation of Cardinal Pell, whom I believe is a hero. Cicero in the Proarchia talks about, in his time as a politician, that he would use his reading first to give historical examples for inspiration, and also works for mental repose to kind of refresh his spirit. Now, I know you mentioned Churchill. What are the works that during your time as Prime Minister that you would go back to find that kind of refreshment of spirit to be able to go back into the fray?
Okay, well, one of the problems with a very active public life is that you have almost no time. For instance, when I was party leader and then Prime Minister, my day would begin at about 4:30 in the morning with a bit of exercise to clear the head. The first meeting of the day would start at 6 a.m, which would be a kind of a media review and look at what was coming in the next 24 hours. Then there'd be meetings to talk about what may or may not happen in Parliament that day. You'd then have all sorts of things, maybe media events, meetings, the question time combat. Most evenings you'd have official dinners of one sort or another, party fundraisers, etc. So the honest truth is that for the best part of the last 40 years, I have been drawing down my intellectual capital. I remember talking to a politician, a minister in a Labor Party minister in the Whitlam government, who became a friend of mine in subsequent years because he was the chief editorial writer of the Australian newspaper for a while. His name was John Wilder. And John said, you know, up until the age of about 25, would probably read at least one a week. Since then, I've read tens of thousands of newspaper articles and 10 briefing papers, but hardly a single book. So that is my problem as well. But in the end, what keeps you going, I guess, is trying to immerse yourself in uplifting biography. And that's why I think if you're a democratic politician, Churchill is such a wonderful study. And if anyone wants to know more about Churchill, they should go out and buy Andrew Roberts' biography, because while it is, they say, probably about the 1,000th biography written of Churchill, if you read that one, you don't have to read any of the others.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for those remarks. They were truly inspirational. And the question I had was there a time during your Prime Minister leadership that your character was most put to the test, a moment that you had to kind of fight through, and your resolve was the tool that allowed you to do that?
Okay. Well, you bring to all of the challenges of life, I guess, your God-given, your environmentally reinforced, educationally helped character. And I guess some of us are this way, some of us are that way. Some of us are more, forthright. Some of us are more accommodating. But for me, probably the most testing period of time was the days after Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 was shot down over eastern Ukraine by a Russian missile battery, and amongst the 298 people killed were 38 Australian citizens. And there was an instant temptation to see this as a tragedy, but I thought, no, this is not a tragedy, this is an atrocity. This is not an accident, this is a crime. And so I called it a crime, an atrocity, and I said that we all know who's to blame here, and it was someone who has more recently been responsible for even more unspeakable evil than transpired on that day. And I don't know that I can say that it was any particular thing that caused me to go one way rather than the other way. And at the time, a lot of people said I was making a bad situation worse by being too robust in what I said and did against the Russian dictator. But in retrospect, if anything, I was too soft on him.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you for joining us today. My question is about civil discourse. I'm a Great Hearts Humane Letters teacher, and I think all of us have a good understanding that civil discourse is essential to a functional republic or democratic republic, and we're seeing the younger generation unable to engage in civil discourse. Do you think it's possible to reverse that situation at the point that we're at?
Well, I think you make a very good point. And one of the points that was made eloquently by our opening speaker today is that we need civil discourse, and we also need, if you like, an educated citizenry, not necessarily to the point of PhDs in science and so on, but at least educated into a knowledge and some understanding of the things that have shaped us. It's interesting, all of Churchill's wartime speeches involved references to British history, our Long Island story. He kept drawing on, and I guess he only did that because he knew that 99.9% of his hearers were familiar with these stories. and that was why it resonated with them. Now, the problem today is we are very ignorant of all of this. We are oblivious, largely oblivious, most of us, to these things. For instance, it's quite common these days in Australia, even for people in positions of authority who, I dare say, have got degrees, even higher degrees, to get mixed up between Captain Cook and Governor Phillip. Captain Cook, who was the first European to find the east coast of Australia, and Governor Phillip, who led the first fleet to begin British settlement 18 years later. And if you don't understand the difference between Captain Cook and Governor Phillip, how can you even begin to have a sensible conversation about anything? So I must say, I try not to feel scornful of such invincible ignorance, but it is hard not to. But you're right, if you can swallow your disdain for people who don't know the things that they really should, you then have to be able to have a discussion which tries to appreciate that people of goodwill can honestly differ on important subjects. But again, there are times when it's hard to accept that people who are genuinely seeking truth, as opposed to trying to push a political agenda, can be heedless of things. I mean, I think you can well and truly argue about whether the Israeli government is doing the right thing in its tactics to destroy Hamas. And you can certainly argue, I guess, whether it's possible to destroy Hamas. And you might say that Hamas is a sort of a noxious idea as opposed to an organisation, and ideas can't be killed. But I don't think it's possible to say that there's moral equivalence between Hamas and the Israeli government, and yet there are lots and lots of people out there who do. Now, do you kind of turn your back on them, shake the dust from your feet and walk on, or do you say, I will, for the great good, continue to engage in the hope of some better understanding?
Thank you so much, Prime Minister. I'm curious about the political side from sort of about educators. I didn't come from a classical tradition. When I arrived with my children, I thought, I have a deficit in my formation because I wasn't engaging in this rich dialogue earlier. And I think it comes from teachers. So I wonder if there's more thought about every teacher needs to have this base so they can enter in and change or move this next generation of civil discord and the other pieces we talked about. Is there something that we need to say that every teacher needs to have before they can move forward? And what would that look like in policy? Or
well, having been a teacher myself and outside of profession, it seems to me that the things that are absolutely essential for someone who would be an effective teacher is a certain level of knowledge and expertise in the relevant subject matter, a general affection stroke love for young people and a desire to do the right thing by them, and a kind of intellectual curiosity. So knowledge, appreciation and curiosity, I think they're the essential things. And I guess the difference between some individuals and some institutions and others is that, you know, the level of expertise, the particular curriculum, etc., might be judged to be better and higher some places than elsewhere. But I reckon if you've got those basics, you can eventually make amends for any deficiencies. I mean, so many of the brightest people had very, very little formal education. I mean, Abraham Lincoln, for instance, had very little formal education. He was self-educated. One of our best Prime Minister, a guy called Ben Chifley, a Labor Prime Minister in the 1940s, he was actually an engine driver, a locomotive driver, before he went into Parliament, and he was largely self-educated. In fact, many of the great people of the previous generations were autodidacts. And so if you read the right books and I suppose look to the right examples, it's amazing what you can do in terms of both being taught and teaching yourself.
Thank you.
I'm conscious of our time, but I would like to give our questioners who are already on their feet an opportunity. But if we could calibrate both question and answer to...
Yes.
No, not at all.
I'm being told by my former staffer to shut up. That's what... She knows that it's much easier for a politician to talk himself into trouble than out of trouble.
Yeah. But please.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for your robust views. As you pointed out, both Australia and the United States suffer from the same afflictions: hyper-secularism, unstoppable wokeness, more diversity than we can shake a stick at. But as both countries try to stem the rot, what can we in the United States learn from the Australian experience? What can you teach us about this?
Well, it's nice that an American wants to learn from another country.
I'm British.
Well, there you are. We can all learn from Mother England, can't we? Look, I'm a very proud Australian, and I wouldn't want to say that there's anything that we have, especially to teach the United States right now. I suspect that in recent times we've been more responsible for bad example than good. For instance, Americans who used to think that Australians were basically like Texans, with the motto, live free or die, were particularly dismayed by the way Australians locked themselves up for the best part of 2 years during the pandemic. In fact, Melbourne became the world's most locked down city outside of China, with limits on how far you could travel, restrictions on going out of the house. You could only go out of the house for 1 hour in 24. There was a 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. curfew. These were restrictions that weren't in place even in wartime. And I know a lot of people right around the world thought, what the hell has gone wrong with Australia? But the late, great Clive James actually put his finger on it when he said that the truth about Australians is not that we're a nation of larrikins descended from convicts. Actually, we're a nation of authoritarians descended from prison wardens.
Thank you for being here, Mr. Prime Minister. I actually have a question about Australian political institutions that I thought you could chime in on. In your country, do you see a correlation between the decline of classical education and the rise of extremist politics such as the Greens or One Nation?
Look, I don't say this, therefore that. I personally think that the rise of fringe parties is more a function of the decline of centre parties. If the Labor Party was doing its job, the Greens wouldn't be as strong as they are. And if the centre-right coalition Liberal National Party were doing our job, parties like One Nation wouldn't exist. And it's interesting that One Nation came into being in the late 90s when the Howard government was struggling to find its feet. But after the Howard government hit its straps after the 1998 election, one nation virtually disappeared. Now it's come back again, and interestingly it's come back again in, I think, a more mellow and more decent guise, because I think Pauline Hanson is actually a better human being. Certainly I think she's grown through all sorts of things, including personal suffering in the interim. But even so, I think that you would have fewer fringe parties if the political mainstream were more effective.
Thank you.
All right, good afternoon. I am going to ask potentially what might be a little bit of a spicy question, but I am going to preface it by saying that I'm absolutely an advocate for liberal education, and that I think schools are our most powerful tools for creating a cohesive society where we all have common reference points. As classical educators, and not to discount the historical influence and value of Judeo-Christian texts, for those of us working in a public school context, do you think that there is a way that we can, I don't want to use the word divorce, but separate classical education and liberal education specifically from like things like the New Testament? And if not, what does that mean for our students who are coming from other faith backgrounds?
Yeah. Well, if you're going to operate in Australia, for instance, you have to learn the English language. I mean, there's just no choice. You have to know the English language if you are going to operate in Australia. And I think if you're going to understand Australia, you need at least some familiarity with the gospel stories, even if it's only the parable of the prodigal son and the parable of the Good Samaritan, because these are things which are just so deeply entrenched in so many things. Our concept of the fair go, the notion that you should have a go. I mean, democracy itself rests on the belief that every person is equal, at least in God-given rights and dignity and responsibility. So I think, in fairness to young people, you have got to give them this, whether you believe in it or not. In any religious sense, it is such an important cultural artefact that to steer clear of it because you don't want to be accused of, I suppose, turning schooling into religion, I just think is wrong. I mean, I don't want to over-dramatise, but I mean, a kid in a Western country who doesn't know any of the gospel stories is so profoundly ignorant that it would be very hard for that person to understand anything much about what goes on. That's my honest view. I reckon it would be a form of child abuse not to share these things with young people.
Last question.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I was just wondering, what texts from your education do you think were most formative to your philosophy and approach to leadership?
Okay. Well, I don't know whether it's good or bad to say this to an American audience, but the book I read at school that I probably found more riveting and uplifting than any other was Huckleberry Finn. Now, I understand that in modern America that's not exactly on the index of forbidden books, but certainly I gather it has to be expurgated in some way in order to avoid offending modern sensibilities. But look, Huck Finn was such a great book, such a wonderful story of not just growing up, but of the getting of wisdom in really, really important ways. And the hero of Huck Finn wasn't the white kid. The hero of Huck Finn was indeed the slave, who was by far the best person in the book. So look, that was very important, and I'm very pleased that political correctness hadn't taken it off the school curriculum back then.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you again, Mr. Abbott. for spending time with us this afternoon, for being so expansive and forthright in your answers to these questions. We have a small amount of housekeeping to dispense with before you'll once again turn loose to your breakout sessions. Carol has asked me to remind everyone we'll be back here at 8:30 tomorrow morning for a keynote address by Dr. Jennifer Frey of the University of Tulsa Honors College. So please do join us for that at 8:30 tomorrow morning. With that, we'll break for a moment and then reconvene in our respective breakouts. And once again, if you'll join me in thanking former Prime Minister Tony Abbott. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Helen.
Well done.